They said Eddard Stark died a traitor in King's Landing, his head taken by the boy King Joffrey before half of Westeros. But the truth was far colder and more secret. Lord Varys, the spider, had whispered to him in the blackest hour of his prison, offering a shadow of mercy cloaked in exile. "Take the black," Varys had said, "and live. For your family, for the realm. What good is your death but a monument to honor?" Honor, that word had once ruled Ned's life. It had cost him friends, made him enemies, and now almost took his head. But when he thought of Arya hiding in the city, of Sansa sobbing in the Red Keep, of Robb marching to war, he did something he thought he'd never do. He'd lied. He confessed to treason he never committed. He bent his knee, not to a king, but to the will of survival. And so, in the dead of night, his death faked by Varys and a few bribed guards, Eddard Stark was smuggled out of the Red Keep in the rags of a beggar and put aboard a ship bound for Eastwatch by Vacy. His name was stripped from him, his legacy buried in lies. No longer Lord of Winterfell, no longer Hand of the King, just another black-cloaked ghost among the cold stones of the wall. The wall didn't ask for names or pasts. It only asked for service. The journey north aged him in ways time never could. The cold wind biting through his bones was not unlike the guilt that gnawed at his soul. He thought of Cat, of Bran still lying broken, of Jon. Gods, Jon. He hadn't even been able to say goodbye. When he arrived, the Night's Watch was little more than a fading memory of what it had once been. Old, bitter men held what little power there was. New recruits were thieves, bastards, rapers, all outcasts. And there stood Ned Stark, a lord among them, now stripped of title, clinging to the ashes of purpose. He kept his head down at first, his true identity known only to Maester Aemon and the Lord Commander Jorah Mormont. They welcomed him not as a prisoner or traitor, but as a man lost in the storm. Mormont, already feeling the weight of age, saw something in him. Not just a man of honor, but someone the Watch could rally behind when darkness began to stir in the far north. Rumors came like snowflakes soft at first, but deadly when gathered. Rangers vanished beyond the wall, villages emptied, no signs of wildlings or struggle, just silence and blood. Something ancient was moving, and the Watch, broken and undermanned, was not ready. In time, Ned couldn't stay in the shadows. His instincts those of a leader, a protectoros. He trained recruits, not with cruelty, but discipline. He walked the ramparts, not out of duty, but because every howl of the wind reminded him that danger was no longer a rumor was coming. Then came the tragedy. A ranging party, led by Mormont's own nephew, went missing. Another dozen gone, and with them the old Lord Commander's hope, in the silence of the cold council chamber. Jorah Mormont looked at the man who once knelt before a southern king and said, "They need a Stark. They always have." And just like that, the words were spoken. No vote, no ceremony, just cold truth. Ned Stark was named Lord Commander. He stood before the men of the Watch, not as a Stark of Winterfell, not as a former lord, but as one of them. He bore their black. He carried their burdens. And his first words, as Lord Commander, cut through the cold like a sword. "We may be forgotten by the world, but we will not forget who we are. We are the shield that guards the realms of men. And I will stand with you until my last breath." But the wall had never needed words. It needed strength. It needed fire. And beyond that frozen barrier, something was already watching. Something old, something cruel. And it had not forgotten the name Stark. It took time for the men of the Night's Watch to trust him. Even in black, Ned Stark's name carried weight. Some whispered he was a traitor, a man who bent the knee to a false king. Others believed he was a ghost, come back to haunt the wall. But most, they saw the man himself. He ate with them, trained beside them, stood shoulder to shoulder during patrols when the wind threatened to flay skin from bone. He earned their respect not with grand speeches, but by bleeding beside them. He appointed new officers men he knew would act, not scheme. Seer Alistair Thorne's venom was curbed. Janos Slint, who had wormed his way to the wall after losing favour in King's Landing, was sent to the Shadow Tower, far from trouble. Ned didn't need snakes at Castle Black. He needed wolves. Still, the wall was restless. Reports kept arriving from beyond wildlings on the move, entire clans pushing south, not for conquest, but for escape. From what, none could say. They called it the Cold Thing, or the White Shadows. Men with blue eyes and no souls. Rangers returned, shaken, even silent. A few never returned at all. Ned remembered old Nan's stories, of the long night, of white walkers and dead things. He used to laugh at them, once. But now he knew some legends were warnings dressed as bedtime tales. Then came Craster. The journey beyond the wall was brutal. He led the ranging himself. He needed to see what haunted his men. Ghosts didn't shake him, but truth did. Craster's keep was a foul place. The old wildling welcomed the night's watch with his usual scowl and stink. He offered shelter, but behind every glance was suspicion. His wives, his daughters, his property stayed silent, their eyes hollow. But it was Gerd, one of Ned's scouts, who returned, trembling from the woods behind the hut. "My Lord Commander," he whispered, dragging Ned aside. "You need to see this." What Ned saw chilled his blood more than the frost. A clearing, surrounded by ancient trees. A ring of stones. In the center, bone small ones, the remains of babes. Craster's sacrifices. "He gives them to the others," Gerd said. "That's why they don't touch him." Ned wanted to kill Craster then and there, but they were deep in the wilds, outnumbered by Craster's kin. He held his blade back, but his decision was made. The watch would not return to Craster's keep. Not ever. They camped one more night, uneasy. That was when they came. It started with silence. Even the wind stopped. Then came the cold, deeper than snow, biting at the soul. The fire turned blue. One of the brothers, young Duron, stepped away from camp to piss, and never returned. They found him an hour later. He was standing in the snow, naked, his eyes shining blue. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. And when Seer Bannon tried to speak to him, the boy lunged dripping Bannon's throat open with his bare hands. The camp erupted. Swords drawn, shouts. Darren no longer Darren kept, moving even as arrows pierced his flesh. Only fire stopped him. Ned's torch caught the boy's cloak and burned him until he dropped like melted wax. "We're leaving," Ned ordered, no longer waiting. The journey back was faster, too fast. Men barely slept. The wind howled behind them, but it wasn't the weather they feared, it was the silence in between. Castle Black greeted them with relief, but there was no rest. Ned called his council immediately. "We are not facing raiders," he told them. "We are facing death itself. The White Walkers are real, and they are coming." Some laughed, some looked away, but enough listened. And as winter clawed further south, Ned sent a raven, not to the king, not to the south, but to Winterfell, to Jon Snow, his son, his blood. His warning was simple: come to the wall, bring all who will follow. Winter is here. The raven arrived in Winterfell. just as the first snow of true winter blanketed the godswood. Jon Snow stood beneath the weirwood, the red leaves whispering in the wind, when Maester Luwin found him. The scroll was sealed in black wax, marked. With no sigil, Jon's hands trembled slightly as he read, "Come to the wall, bring all who will follow. Winter is here." There was no signature, but Jon didn't need one. He knew his father's words. Robb had been declared king in the north, by then waging war in the Riverlands. Winterfell stood guarded by a skeleton crews, Yer Roderick, Maester Luwin, a handful of loyal men, and Jon Snow, still nursing wounds from the fight at the Fist of the First Men, where he had seen things even Sam dared not describe in daylight. When Jon showed the letter to Luwin, the old maester's face went pale. "He's alive," Luwin whispered, voice cracked by disbelief. "Ned Stark, he lives." Jon said nothing, but inside, the storm raged. All his life, he had been told who he was: a bastard, a ward, a snow-born shadow in a house of wolves. But now the one man he had mourned most had called to him, not as a lord, not as a king, but as a father in need. Jon didn't hesitate. He rode that very night, accompanied by Ghost and 24 men who would follow him into the snow without question. The rest thought him mad, abandoning his place in Winterfell, chasing shadows. But Jon had seen the truth in the far north. He had seen blue eyes staring out of dead faces. He had seen what the South still called myth. He was returning to the wall not as a boy, but as a warning. When Jon arrived at Castle Black, the wall looked different. It no longer felt forgotten. It felt like the last fortress standing before the world fell apart. Fires burned higher. Guards stood stiffer. And above it all, in black armor dulled by frost, stood Lord Commander Ned Stark. Jon dismounted and walked straight to the steps. When their eyes met, time seemed to freeze. No words were needed. Ned embraced his son like a man risen from death. Jon didn't know whether to cry or shout. "They said you were dead," he whispered. "They said they took your head. They took everything," Ned said quietly, "but not my purpose." Inside, the warmth of Castle Black's grate holded little to melt the frost between the past and present. Ned explained everything: his escape, his decision, the dead boy in the forest, the blue fire in their eyes. Jon listened, jaw clenched. "We've both seen them," he said. "They're not just coming. They're already here." Ned nodded, and no one in the South believes a word of it. The Night's Watch was changing. Under Ned's command, discipline returned. Training intensified. Blacksmiths worked through the night forging spears, bolts, anything that might hold dragon glass or steel. Samwell Tarly had returned from Old Town with ancient books, scrolls that spoke of obsidian, Valyrian steel. And the last long night, Jon took charge of the new recruits. He knew how they thought, how they feared. He drilled them without mercy, because mercy would not come from what hunted them. But the hardest part for Jon was this: he was not a brother of the Watch anymore. He was something else, and he didn't know where he belonged. "Go back to Winterfell," Ned told him one night. "Tell Robb, tell the North. We'll need every man, every sword." But Jon shook his head. "You called me, I came. I'll not leave you again." Ned didn't argue. Father and son stood on the wall that night, side by side, looking out into the dark. Snow fell softly, like ash from a burning world. Jon broke the silence. "They're gathering, aren't they?" Ned's jaw tightened. "Aye, we have weeks." maybe less. Below them, black-clad men trained in the snow. Above, the wind howled, and far beyond the trees, unseen but not forgotten, the army of the dead moved. They were coming, and this time there would be no retreat. The ravens flew, and the waiting began. Ned Stark had sent letters not only to Robb, but to every bannerman of the North. House Manderley, House Karstark, House Umber, even House Bolton, though Ned's fingers had trembled before signing that one. They all needed to understand that this was no rebellion. This was survival. The wall was no longer a prison for the realm's unwanted. It was the only line between life and death. And yet days passed, then weeks. Only silence answered. Jon pored over the old tomes with Sam, searching for weapons in words. The ancient pages spoke of dragon glass buried deep in the mountains, of fire wielded by the children of the forest, of a battle fought in eternal night. Sam uncovered a single line that chilled them both. The wall was not built to keep wildlings out, it was built to hold something in. Ned listened. He wasn't a scholar, but he was no fool. He believed in the things he'd seen: the pale blue flame of the undead boy, the wind that froze bone through leather, and so he prepared. Every man who could lift a sword trained, every blacksmith forged night and day. He ordered tunnels collapsed, stairwells reinforced, gates triple barricaded. For the first time in decades, Castle Black stood truly fortified, but defenses only held when men stood behind them. That was the problem. They didn't have enough. "We'll need more than swords," Jon said one night, standing before the weirwood at the edge of the forest. "We need fire." He was right. Fire had stopped the white-eyed boy. Fire had turned dread into ash. That's when Ned made a decision he never thought he would. He sent Jon south again, but not to Robb. To Dragonstone, he said, "Find Daenerys Targaryen. If the tales are true, she has dragons." Jon argued. He didn't want to leave, not again. But Ned's eyes were firm. "She's fire, Jon, and we are out of time." Jon left within hours, cloaked in black and shadow, Ghost at his side. A handful of brothers went with him. The rest remained, knowing what approach would not wait for southern kings or ancient bloodlines. The next night, the forest screamed. Not a howl, not a storm, a scream. It rolled across the trees like thunder, waking every man in Castle Black. Torches were lit, horns sounded. Men ran to the ramparts, blades half drawn, eyes wide. Then silence again. Ned stood at the top of the wall, sword in hand, breath steaming in the cold. And then he saw them. Shapes in the trees, dozens, then hundreds. Shadows moving unnaturally, jerking forward, arms swaying like broken dolls. The moonlight caught their faces, what was left of them, frozen skin, hollow sockets, flesh stretched over bone. And behind them, glowing like twin blue stars, came the others, the White Walkers. Ned didn't hesitate. "Archers," he roared, "fire arrows only. Light the braziers." The sky lit with flame. Arrows hissed downward, some striking the dead. Those that hit the walkers themselves shattered like glass. One arrow found a corpse's chest, hit, lit instantly, falling in ashes. But most kept coming. Then the wall itself shook, not from attack but from within. The cry came from the far side. The Shadow Tower. One of the ravens had returned from the west, bearing news of horror. A massacre. The undead had breached a tunnel through the Frostfangs. The Shadow Tower had fallen. Ned realized the truth at once. This wasn't an attack, it was a siege. They weren't just coming for Castle Black, they were surrounding the wall, testing it, probing for weakness, and they would find one. Seal the inner gate, Ned ordered. Send riders east and west, warn Eastwatch and the ruins of the Shadow Tower. If they breach the wall, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because as the flames danced on the snow and the blue eyes of death glimmered in the night, one thing became clear. The wall was no longer just a border. It was the front line of the last war. Dawn never came. The sun hid behind an endless curtain of clouds as the storm swept across the wall. Snow fell sideways, driven by winds that screamed like ghosts. The dead stood just beyond the tree line, silent and patient. They had no need for haste. Time belonged to them. Inside Castle Black, the brothers of the Night's Watch prepared to die. Ned walked among them, quiet and calm. He spoke little, only laid his hand on shoulders, offered nods, and met their eyes. He saw fear in every face, but also something more. Resolve they would not run. He stood before the black gate one last time, the cold creeping into his bones like old regret. His breath fogged the air, his beard thick with frost. He drew his sword, not ice long lost in the south, but a plain steel blade wrapped in black leather. He had no sigil anymore, no family name to cling to. Just purpose. He climbed the wall, from the top. He saw it all. The army of the dead stretched across the horizon, thousands of them. Corpses dragged from forests, frozen lakes, old battlefields. Creatures that once walked, rode, or crawled. In the center stood the White Walkers, pale and perfect, with swords of ice and hearts that had never beaten. And behind them, barely visible, a shape moved. Larger than the rest, mounted a walker on the back of a monstrous undead. Direwolf, Ned's blood ran colder than the wind. They've learned, he whispered. They remember us. A horn blew once, then again, and then the wall cracked. Not from below, but above, a blue light pierced the clouds. For a moment, it seemed like lightning. But it wasn't. It came from the north, from the sky. And then they saw its wings, wide and ragged, scales blackened by frost, eyes glowing like twin sapphires. A dragon. An undead dragon. Ned staggered back. The creature shrieked, and with it came fire blue, cold and wrong. It slammed into the wall far west of Castle Black, where the Shadow Tower had once stood. Stone exploded. The wall began to fall. Ned screamed for the bells. 2 arms, all men 2 arms. The undead surged forward, faster than any living man could move. Arrows flew, fire rained, and still they came. Castle Black trembled under the weight of the onslaught. Brothers fought, died, rose again. Some burned, some screamed, some simply disappeared into the snow. Ned fought at the gate, sword swinging, cutting down corpses, torch in the other hand. Around him, men died by the dozens, but they held. For hours they held. And then, as the dead reached the inner yard, a second horn blew, and this one was southern. Riders burst through the Eastwatch past northern bannermen, bearing the direwolf banner, the Manderleys, the Umbers, even the Boltons. Behind them rode Jon's snow-black cloak flapping, long claw in hand, fire in his eyes. And beside him, dragons, real ones, alive, Daenerys. Stormborn flew at his side, her dragons unleashing red and gold fury on the undead. Fire turned night into day. Corpses lit like torches. The dead screamed as they died again. The tide turned. Ned stood in the ruins of Castle Black's gate, soaked in blood and ash, watching his son rise in battle, leading men and beasts into fire. He had never been prouder, but then he saw it. The walker on the dire wolf, it charged, and Ned knew. Some deaths could not be borrowed forever. He faced the creature as it leaped. His sword rose, his torch dropped, and as the cold claws reached for him, he whispered the name of every child he'd never see again. Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon, Jon, and then fire. Jon had seen him. Longclaw arced through the air, catching the White Walker before it struck. The creature burst like glass. The direwolf collapsed. Ned dropped to his knees, barely breathing. Jon stood above him, pulling him up. "You're not dying today," he said. Ned coughed. "There's always tomorrow." When the battle ended, the snow was blackened with ash. Castle Black stood in ruins, but the wall most of it still held. The dead were broken. For now, Ned Stark stood at the top of the wall again, beside Jon, watching the smoke rise over the forest. "We held," Jon said. Ned nodded. "We did." But in his heart, he knew this was just the first storm, and winter was far from over.